Pakistan play in the making of India-Chinese relations, and what difference does the changing India-Pakistan relationship make on their relations with China?
Thank you. Next question. Yes.
Okay, my name is Tang Li. As everyone knows, I run a blog. My comment is more to Professor Rajesh Basu, that you made a point that China is going through a state of domestic and political stress, in the sense that you have a communist government with a very capitalistic economy, and how do the two meet? And okay, what I've talking to a few people, the answer is China gets along right now because the people running China, as maybe communists, are very pragmatic. But how does everything change if you get a situation where China has a political upheaval and the system of government has to be more responsive to nationalistic feelings on the ground?
Good question. Surya?
Yeah. There was this mention of hierarchy of interests for China with reference to the US. And Professor Raja Mohan also spoke of the possibility of a US card for India. In terms of hierarchy of interests, how would you position these three countries?
And one last question for this first set. Yes?
My name is Aparna Raman. I just want to ask that India's foreign policy may be slightly more tilted towards the US right now. But really for the average citizen of India, it is more of an envious approach towards China. It's like the top middle class. The progress and the prosperity of China have inspired a lot of Indians like me, middle class Indians. And we wonder why the Indian state cannot take a leaf or learn out of China rather than indulging in some sort of competition. Why not co-opt China and learn from them? Because frankly, as an Indian, I'm more inspired by China than I'm inspired by India itself.
Thanks. So the first round, you can start with Resurgent.
Pallavi's question on, there has been a triangle in terms of what happens between India, Pakistan and China, which going right back to the 49-50 period itself, where you see the Chinese reaching out to Pakistan, even when the relationship with India was very good. And you see in Bandung, where actually the Chinese and the Pakistanis make the first contact, and it sets the stage for a transformation of their relationship. I think the classical view is that, look, I mean, China wants to balance India, therefore Pakistan will always be an instrument. So therefore, it's up, what China has done for Pakistan, giving nuclear technology, missile technology. So it is a classical way of limiting India's freedom by supporting Pakistan. Now, in India, there's always been a big debate. I mean, do we cut a deal with Pakistan so that our space will improve, or do you try to change the dynamic with Pakistan, with China? I think we've tried both. I mean, in both directions. I mean, the success is still elusive. But the general argument would be, look, China is a state. At least you can deal with a coherent state, and without any of the burden of partition, etc. That actually someday maybe you can do a deal with China. But Pakistan has become far more complicated. It's linked deeply to India's own partition, so therefore it's far more messier. But I think whichever direction India moves, it carves itself out more space, because it frees India to do more things both within the region and globally. So any normalization, any improvement with Pakistan and China, or either only one of them, it gives India more room to play. And that's why consistently you had last three governments of different political persuasions have sought to change the relationship with both China and Pakistan. On domestic upheaval, I mean, I have a problem that you can't make any policy on the basis China will weaken because of domestic. And the Chinese look at India and say, look, lucky to be China, when look at India's weaknesses. I mean, the region. So I don't think China's internal weaknesses automatically make it easier for India to deal with the problem. Lucky if you get a bonus. But you can't run a foreign policy on the expectation that something terrible will happen in China. Therefore, both of us, I think, are deeply vulnerable domestically. And you would say India has more vulnerabilities. Or some would say, look, China has more vulnerabilities. But I think that's a condition that affects both. On the hierarchy, look, I think US is number one, China is number two, India is. So I think India is in a kind of position where China was when Deng Xiaoping took charge, the US-China, US-Russia rivalry, the Second Cold War, Deng Xiaoping brilliantly leveraged it for China's transformation by getting Western support and simultaneously normalizing relationship with the Soviet Union. So if anything, India can learn from China, as I said, certainly on foreign policy, how Deng Xiaoping actually used a very opportune moment to transform China itself. But India, there's far more nervousness of playing this game, but I think the template still exists. One, I think China is already an example. Like throughout the reform period, that the exhortation for domestic audiences was, look, Communist China is doing this, why is the stupid Indian Communist Party of India Marxist? Doesn't understand. So you're always pointing to, look, China is doing this, China has lowered barriers, so therefore we must do it. China is liberalizing foreign direct investment, therefore we must do it. So China is already the benchmark. So there is a China benchmark in the domestic discourse on how we think about ourselves for the future. But clearly, I mean, a whole new generation, I think the nature of an explosive, dramatic expansion of contact between China and India is just bigger. I mean, Chinese are issuing visas for 500,000, it's 500,000. India is much less. So there is going to be these two economies, more they connect. There's going to be a dramatic explosion, expansion of the relationship. And still, I mean, China is number 2 economy, India will get, there's already number 10, hopefully we'll get to number 5 in the next 5 years. It is inevitable. But the problem, there are other problems. As neighbors, nobody likes the neighbors. China is sitting on our territory. You ask the Chinese say, look, they're sitting, giving refuge to Dalai Lama. And imagine if China had a government in exile of Kashmir. But that's what we're doing. And of course, we tell the Chinese with a straight face, Dalai Lama is a spiritual figure. Maybe he is. But there is a problem of territoriality, which you can't take away. But meanwhile, there's expansion of economic cooperation, there's expansion of a whole range of things. So things are beginning to happen for the first time since our independence. In the 50s, it was mere talk. Bye-bye, there was nothing, there was no economic contact. But today, there is substance to that relationship, and that's what makes it very, very different.
I think Raja has said pretty much all there is to be said, but just a couple of minor points. And one is that, you know, to understand the politics of what we can call Southern Asia, we have to recognize that there is always, as he said, domestic politics at play. And the fact is that domestic politics being at play means that it's very hard to compromise and negotiate a solution beyond a point to the disputes between India and Pakistan and between India and China. All three governments are relatively weak. I said it's, again, a hierarchy of weakness, maybe, you know, that Pakistan seems to be worse off today. But the fact is that no Indian government, which is a coalition government, is going to be able to compromise on the border very easily. And for that matter, it's not that different in China. You know, it's not a question of, you know, monolithic party rule. It's that I think the Chinese themselves have said again and again, usually obliquely, that they are internally vulnerable, that they are in a state of transition and they are struggling to deal with it. And the one legitimizing factor is nationalism in all three countries. And because of that, we are not going to see any solution. At the same time, you know, we have this problem, security, whatever you call it, domestic politics. On the other side, we have you know, a rising trend of economic cooperation. And that's going to be happening between India and Pakistan as well, and we can see it coming. The point is that the two will coexist, as they have between so many countries, between Japan and China, between the US and China. So the game is hedging. And in a hedging game, you know, making some kind of grand strategy is very, very difficult. I think they just play it ad hoc and see what happens. Try to keep the relationship within a band, so to speak, where it doesn't go into, you know, too much of conflict, and the possibility of much more collaboration and cooperation is also constrained. I think you are the best qualified to answer your own question on India-Pakistan relations with China. But I think here, how you answer the question, how you define the question depends very much on your views. So if you are like Raja Mohan, a hard realist, a structural realist, then you hear what the views are. But if you take a more liberal institutionalist perspective, you get entirely different. I suspect you're going more on the constructivist view of that relation, where it becomes an issue of how Pakistan is constructing its identity over the years. You know, in the 50s, under the military rule, Khan was one. Then when General Zia comes in 1972, there's a complete change of Pakistan's identity and the way it thinks of itself as a Muslim nation. And then post 9/11, it's completely different again. So I think our Indian friends would have to live with Pakistan's struggles to define who and what it is in the world today.
I think when Deng Xiaoping changed China, he had an incredible advantage of a horrible nightmare that China lived through prior to that, which is of course the Cultural Revolution. And with that card in hand, he could institute a lot of the change. And if you are to believe Farid Zakaria's piece about the depoliticization of the Chinese political system, which he wrote during the time when Bo Xilai was arrested, that what Deng did was actually to reduce the political side of things and made the leadership much more technocratic. So the issue was solving economic problems, bringing economic growth to individual cities or whatever it was, until we come to what we see today, where cities fight with each other for investment. Everybody wants to have a financial center. I mean, it's in the middle of nowhere, it wants a financial center. But that's how it is. But Deng did that because everyone was a civil servant or a party member. You got your promotion in the party and you were assigned, you were not elected. The domestic issues and the state politics or even the municipal politics in India are extremely complicated. But China has a whole different set of municipal and provincial problems. Not so much about elected politics, but how do you actually deliver these goods in this day and age, which I think the leadership is finding it more and more difficult. And it is because of that a lot of Chinese business people, they're running scared. I mean, if you meet up with many of them, why have they moved out so much money out of China? Why have they gone and tried to buy land, tried to buy houses, tried to buy huge tracts of forest? Now, some people believe they're acting for the Chinese government. They may well be. But many of them are certainly wealthy enough to buy some of these things. I'm sitting at a conversation. This man was seriously talking because he is a great environmentalist. He has plenty of money. His company on NASDAQ is worth about $2 billion. He himself is worth several $1 billion. And he's talking about buying 50,000 square kilometers of Brazilian jungle. So it's only one of the jungle. He said, never mind, I mean, jungles will grow, I don't have to tend it, and wood is always important. And we just keep it, and it's environmentally very good. Because he's a very staunch Buddhist, he doesn't want to rear animals, because then you slaughter the animals and things like that. So he's buying 50,000 square kilometers of jungle. Now, why is all this money going out? Partly, I suspect, now that they have money, they're a little bit scared. What if the mood suddenly changed in China? Individual tycoons have been arrested and they disappear for a while. Their companies are very badly affected, and nobody wants that to happen to them individually. But whether, and this comes to this gentleman's question about whether there's going to be some domestic sort of splits in China. I'm not sure the picture will come out as, well, here's one faction fighting another faction. They will patch it over for as long as they can, even in something that was so challenging for them when they went after Po Xilai. Because Po Xilai was probably the most political of all the leaders, and understanding the politics of China, played up the old Maoist policies, which you cannot attack him for. What's wrong with that? You know, this is like motherhood. And yet now the only way you can go after a leader like Po Xilai is to link him to the murder of this Englishman and other corruption charges. It's nothing to do with politics. But it was a political struggle, obviously, between different factions within China. And those things can manifest itself in terms of some of the economic policies that the country will have to develop. But as of now, at least, I think China has been able to keep that solidarity, that front, in which they will develop some of their foreign policies to see how you're going to take this newfound wealth, their newfound position in the world. The thing that haunts China till today is still the Opium War and the insult that they feel that they have been, they had to pay for during all those years. And if you look at the relationship with Japan, the Japan that China looks at, this is visceral. They can accept almost anything, but with Japan, it's just very, very bad because a very deep, almost cultural difference. And if you go to the city of Nanjing, it's very interesting that all over China you will find Japanese restaurants. Very popular, everybody loves it, they go to Japanese food. But you will never find a Japanese restaurant on the streets of Nanjing. You can find it in the hotels, but not on the street. Because every time a Japanese restaurant opens, its windows get broken, you know, people will smear things on it. Because it's so deep in their entire emotions, it's so high. So they drive down this way, and as they see it, America is their real competitor. That's who they measure themselves against. Japan is someone they have to deal with, a very powerful economy, but it's very easy to light a fuse under the Chinese when it comes to the Japanese. And I think when it comes to India, it is there, but it's not really high on the radar screen, which is, maybe it's to the advantage of South Asia, because you are now becoming much more knowledgeable about China than maybe they are of South Asia, and they should be, for all the reasons that have been said today. And it's quite sad that they don't venture out as much. You take a look at the investments in Bangladesh on garment manufacturing. There are Taiwanese there, there are Koreans there, there are not that many PRC companies there, much less than one would have expected, since most of these garments were once manufactured in China, and yet people are pulling out of China, but when they go out, it is not, they don't go to South Asia.
So that's the chat. Next round, Mr. Ali first.
Thank you. We've listened with great interest this story about the rising China, emerging India, and the fact of South Asia. But I think we cannot have a full discussion without making reference to something about Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia lies between India and China. And I think it's inevitable, as I said historically, that the rivalry of India and China will have an impact on Southeast Asia. So I was wondering if your panelists could venture their opinions on the role of Southeast Asia in the rivalry in the coming years, whether there could be a division of spheres of influence between India and China in Southeast Asia. For example, the lineup of India with Indonesia and Vietnam against China with other countries in the region. And therefore, there will be a whole new dimension to this strategic engagement of China and India with Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Study. Professor Mooney? Let me get a couple more. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Behind it.
Manaswini Ramkumar from ISAS. My question is to Professor Basroor and to Professor Rajamohan. Professor Basroor, your presentation was on perceptions and influence. And I wanted to ask, what is the role of the media between India and China in creating perception and influence? India's overly free liberal media that's fear-mongering about China amongst Indian citizens, and China's publicly controlled media that's at the least dismissive or disingenuous towards India, or at the very worst hawkish towards India. So how does the media creating perceptions among the population affect policy making between these two countries vis-a-vis both?
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. My name is Mo Jikang. I'm a visiting fellow in RSIS. I have two questions. The first one is about water issues. Does Indian government really perceive China's behavior in the Yarlung River as a threat? You know, as I know that India has its own satellites to watch closely on China's behaviors on river. So I think India knows exactly what China is doing. This is the first question. The second question is about Afghanistan issues. India has a lot of interests in Afghanistan, and many Indian experts said that India has very few strategic resources to influence or to protect India's interests in this area. So India needs more cooperation with other countries to deal with this issue. So my question is, which country is India now cooperating or will cooperate most closely? In United States or China or SCO?
One last question for this.
I don't have a question. I have a chapter in the book, but can I make a comment on the way Chinese conduct their diplomacy? And I think all of us should be aware of this. I've been in the government of my country, Bangladesh, for 2 years, but I've lived in China for about 40 years. First as a Pakistani civil servant, and thereafter as a Bangladeshi civil servant. You see, in the late 60s, when Pakistan first began its relations with China, we did a piece on Qian Long's trip to South in 1797, I think it was. The point that was made by the Pakistani minister was that it's an invitation to learn from the South, bringing China, Pakistan close together. 71, when China opposed the division of Pakistan, but not necessarily, I mean, this is the subtlety of Chinese diplomacy, not the creation of Bangladesh, but the division of Pakistan. And China argued that what they were opposing was not the, as I said, the emergence of Bangladesh, but singing in a duet of Soviet social imperialism and Indian expansions. And once that was accepted by our side, they raised Bangladesh to the level of an all-weather friend. So that's how they conduct their diplomacy. And there's something to learn from that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary. I'll get Professor Mooney to respond to the questions. Sorry, I missed his hand earlier.
Thank you, Chair, for the time. First, to some of the panelists, some of the questions raised by panelists. I think there are a number of areas have been identified by Raja Mohan and Professor Basroor, as to why they were not included in the book. What we did was to give a brief to all the contributors. and left it to them. And as you know, the contributors are mostly from the countries where they are writing their perceptions. So it would have been very uncalled for on our part to say that you deal with this issue or you don't deal with this issue. That's why, you know, the question of either water or balance of power or India's border issue, we didn't want to force the contributors to, and therefore it is in a way narrowly state-centric bilateral perception. That's why the US doesn't figure into it in a prominent way. Even India doesn't figure into it in a prominent way. When some of these contributors were relating themselves to China, they did not refer that we are doing it because of India or whatever else it is. I think this is just an explanation to say why areas were left out or were not left out. The second question of the equation between India, Pakistan and China. We must understand that whatever China does in Pakistan is not, and I underline not, entirely for India or because of India. There is a body of independent bilateral relations between the two countries. The Chinese role in Gwadar, which has been a major point of discussion in the media, is not simply to go and sit down for India or to have on the other side. This may be also one of the implications of it. But Gwadar, they started, China has its own defense requirements. And I mentioned it, that China needs South Asian countries. And China needs Pakistan greatly for the Islamic factor, for access to Indian Ocean. Hajj people, before access through Karachi, used to go via Shanghai. Imagine a person going to Hajj via Shanghai from Xinjiang would be spending how much of money unless it wants to take the other route. Therefore, Pakistan route became a very useful route. So this is just one caveat we must, that there is a body of relationship which is independent of India. So far as India is concerned, that many of this, I think some dimensions of this relationship, if the Chinese or the Pakistanis can use it against India, will use it against India. There is absolutely no denying the fact. But a lot of the Chinese support to Pakistan has not gone to the extent what Pakistan expected. And look at the two wars of 65 and 71, very critical. When Pakistan expected a lot, what the Chinese would do, and Chinese did not come up to. Pakistanis may not admit it in public. It's a different story. Therefore, there are limits to what China would do to Pakistan in any India-Pakistani problem. We must understand that also very well. So when you look at this equation, and third aspect of it, that a lot of support from China to Pakistan was also to make sure that Pakistan does not become a launching pad for the US policies, for which it was originally meant as an ally. And up to 60s it continued. But a lot more, and most of the Chinese support have started coming to Pakistan after 64, 65 in a major way. Not in diplomatic and other terms. And this was largely to make sure that Pakistan was not made use of by the US. Imagine a situation from the Chinese perspective that if both India and Pakistan were to cooperate with the US on anything against China, China would be in a terrible mess. Therefore, it is a kind of an equation in which there are other variables and factors we should keep it in mind. The second equation is about India, US and China. And my contention, which Raja said, the point made is absolutely valid, that one will have to look into the parameters of this equation. But at the present, and I think for another 10 or if not 20, if not 30, at least 10 to 15 years to come, a major problem is how China-US equation is shaping up. And why should India put its cards on the table at this stage? I see absolutely no reason for anyone. And there is a debate. We should stand by the US, we should not stand by China, we should stand by China, we should not stand by US. I think this is from India's national interest point of view, the two are engaged with each other. We don't know what kind of an equation they will shape up between themselves. Let us wait and watch and take as much advantage, as Raja said very rightly, out of this relationship. I think that's what the Indian policy seems to be, to my mind, at this stage, and that's what the equation is. In fact, the other day, Kwa raised the question of who is Vishnu. I would say the real problem in Indo-Pacific, the Samudra Manthan. The Samudra Manthan is between China and the US. India is the Vishnu, if I put it to you this way. That we take advantage of this Samudra Manthan as far as we can. When we get into a corner, we'll see how to respond, how not to respond, and try. This is just one perspective to look into it. Now, Tibet, we are not neglecting at all. I mean, you have seen the police patrols protecting the Chinese delegation. You do not know that the Tibetan protesters are from Delhi itself. They live huge. I mean, I'm not disclosing any secrets, but as a student of India's foreign policy, I mean, there is an encouragement to the Tibet, and also there is an assurance to the Chinese that we will not let you humiliated in Delhi. What's wrong with that? I mean, therefore, there is no way. I can give you several examples of how India is not neglecting Tibet at all. And in fact, there is a new resurgence among the Indian strategic community to say that now that peaceful coexistence phase is over, the agreement is over, why should we not open up the Tibetan issue internationally? There is a body of analysts and influential people who want to work it that way. So it's not a question. Now, Raja said radiating Chinese influence in South Asia. Correct, in terms of one proposition that the Chinese influence and capacity to play a greater role in South Asia has tremendously been enhanced. But, and there were questions related to that, but there are severe limits to what extent China can use South Asian countries to harm India, excepting Pakistan. There are absolutely severe limitations. You take specific examples, we can go into it. I mean, no matter the distances are being covered, the infrastructure is being raised, but you can never get the kind of civilizational touch which you have amongst the South Asian countries and between South Asian countries and China. I mean, who will travel on this infrastructure? You can lay down there is a serious question in Nepal, for instance, that if you lay down the rail network and connect it to Tibet, how many people would be using it? There are real limitations on what can be the depth of the engagement, no matter you can create infrastructure for that. I think on subtlety of Chinese diplomacy. You have not seen the other side of the Chinese diplomacy. Please ask the East Asian countries and South China Sea countries. Ask Vietnam. Ask Myanmar, for instance. Ask Philippines, for instance. There are different dimensions of any country's diplomacy. I know there is a lot of discomfort in South Asia in dealing with India because I said we interact with each other almost on every point. We live in each other's intestines. We cannot help but affect each other. Therefore, it worries us most each other. Chinese are distant. There are pleasantries and one can do with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Muni. We've got a few minutes. Raja, to quickly address the few questions.